Well, I think the standard way that everyone does fellowships is really starting off with the ACHE directory, just because it lists really like the fellowships that have been around the longest, and it's like a really convenient list that's right there. But like beyond that, I think like a really good way that I went about it was like I knew I wanted to be in like certain areas, so there are a lot of hospitals that aren't on the ACHE list because they're like new and maybe haven't established themselves as long. So like once I knew the location and researched like all the hospitals there, Googling like their names, and also like hospitals that a fellowship didn't appear on, I would like go on the website and contact them. I know like there were two like really new fellowships that had just been established this year. And I like was lucky enough that I had contacted them, and they, put it on their kind of like their HR website where they would list jobs, but they really didn't have a section on their website for it. So like I think that's a really good way to go about it. A hospital that you want to work at, but you maybe think they don't have a fellowship, it's good to contact them directly. So that helped a lot. Since a lot of the students, went through a pretty, I feel like, rigorous application process to get into BU, I wouldn't say anything really stood out that much on my application, except for like I tried to personalize essays for hospitals. But I feel like getting that first interview, the phone interview, you don't really need to actually do that much. I mean, I'm not saying don't, but I'm saying that I think a lot of people overthink it and get really stressed out about just getting that phone interview. So I would say that as long as you personalize it and it's obvious in your essay that you want to be at this hospital for a particular reason, that's really all you need to do just to get that first, just to open that first door. So beyond like choosing hospitals because of the location, I also knew that I wanted to work at a children's hospital. So that was something that I brought up in those essays. I'd been a teacher before, so I tried to like connect that experience to those hospitals. But I was lucky enough to have that experience. I think other hospitals that weren't children's hospitals, I tried to like mention like why I wanted to be there because like the location. A lot of people will go back to places like they grew up in or maybe they've had a history in. And I think that shows the hospital like, oh, this person is invested to be here, not just this 1 year, but in future years, because they are making an investment in you. There was one city like I'd never been in, never had a history in, so that I think you really do have to emphasize like, oh, why that place? Why? What's going to tie you in the next 5 or 10 years? What's going to keep you there? So like that would be something that I feel like students should have in their essay. There were 4 phases if you include the application. So the application is pretty standard, I feel, across the board. It's just letters of recommendation. Usually, I think this one did require, one from the director of, our program. And then I want to say like it had one major essay and then like another component where it was like maybe half a page of what your personal interests are for the fellowship. And then letters of recs and transcripts. So that was the first part, just submitting the application. The second part was a phone interview with HR. It was just a lot of behavioral questions. And then the second phone interview was with a current fellow. And that was just, a lot of the questions overlap, but I think it's also kind of they're having like a second person to vet you and see if you're like consistent across the board. And then after that, they flew 3 of us in for one position. And they send you an itinerary ahead of time. It's not that long interview. It was a 1-hour interview with the CEO and COO. And then we rotated, and so another hour with the current fellows, and then another hour with the previous fellows. And the whole time I interviewed by myself. So even though there were 2 other candidates, we actually all rotated around. So the only time we sat down together was in the morning when we were waiting, and then at the end of the day when we had kind of like a brief overview of the fellowship. So I had two really unique interviews, both for fellowships that I ended up not getting. But one of them, the hospital sent us an online evaluation component. So it's kind of like another part of the interview. And some of the questions were really standard. It was kind of like, oh, they would give us a statement like, I get along with people, and then you had to rank yourself. But then like another part of the component was you're in front of a computer screen, and they split the screen in half. And on one side of the screen, it's like a simulated email program. So you have like, I think a half hour to do this, but you're getting emails. And as you're getting emails, some of them just contain information and you'll read it. And then other emails contain questions about previous emails. And as you read the emails, they disappear. So you can't go back and, check the information. And it was really basic stuff. It wasn't things to trick you, but it would say something like, hey, this email said we have a meeting Friday morning. Do you remember what time exactly? And you had to remember, did it say 11, 11:30? And it was multiple choice. So you weren't just writing it out. So that helped. And then while you were doing that, on the right side, there was logic questions, which were tricky and were timed and would close out every minute. So it was kind of testing it's obviously testing logic to see if you can answer these questions, but it was also testing, can you juggle two things at once? And that was really tricky. I think there's a little bit of strategy involved. Things like, as soon as I answered a question, instead of hitting next, I would let the clock run out so I would have extra time reading emails. So, that was, I think, a really unique and an interesting one. And then the second one was a Skype interview, which not a lot of the fellowships did, but we had 3 HR people, and it's pretty similar to a phone interview. I guess the only challenge there is like making sure your setting is correct, making sure that your Skype works ahead of time. They didn't even use Skype; they used a different program. So I remember just like really being really nervous because I wasn't familiar and was worried if the program wouldn't work. But yeah, that's it. Well, I did a lot of mock interviews with my professors, with the Career Center. One thing like I hadn't thought of ahead of time, and now, like if I'd gone back, I would have changed this a little more, was I did like 2 mock phone interviews with the Career Center. So the whole time I kept preparing in person, and there was like no point in preparing for the in-person interview because the phone interview came first. And for me, like that's a lot more challenging than interviewing in person, because like on the phone you gotta worry about like your voice. Does it sound okay? Like, are you pausing? Is it like an awkward pause, or is it a natural pause? And how to convey more emotions. So like, for students doing fellowships, I would recommend doing more phone interviews. And really getting feedback on just your personality. Because I remember one of the first feedbacks I got was like, oh, you don't come off as personable on the phone. And that was something that I think if I had worked on ahead of time, maybe I would have, gotten to the next round with more fellowships. So they were really great about that. Their HR person did it. It's pretty basic. The only advice I would say is that mine was scheduled really close to winter break, and I hadn't thought about this, but they flew me out and they flew me back in. One of my friends went on a fellowship site, and he asked them like, would you mind just flying me home from there? So that like helped him out a lot, and they didn't mind at all. And I don't think I don't think they would mind if you like ask, I think for the majority of fellowships, they do things on a rapid timeline, and most of them even put the timeline on their website. They're very clear on, like, by this day you will know this, by this day you'll know this, and phone interviews are scheduled, based off of your schedule and theirs, but usually their on-site interview, it's booked months ahead of time because they have a lot of people that they want you to meet, and they want to make sure they're all there on that one day. So very rarely did I sit around and say, like, oh, I haven't heard from this fellowship for a while. Most of them, it's done really quickly, and I would say over a span of 1 month max. Majority of the questions are behavioral. It's really basic things like, what would you do if you had an argument with someone at work? How do you manage people? Management is like a really big component, since a lot of the fellowships, they're taking people with very little experience, and you're going directly into management. So that's something they really want. They want to get a clear sense of your leadership style. Things like strengths and weaknesses, that's always come up. A really big question that comes up is, like, what have you failed at and what have you learned? Or, they usually don't even ask what have you learned, but it's something kind of implied that I feel like that was something I should have worked on. Case-based questions don't really come up a lot, especially not in the sense of like consulting firms. It does come up sometimes, but it's nowhere near the level of what a consulting firm would ask you. It's more like, can you come up with a framework and, answer in a concise and clear way that they'll understand. So I'm trying to remember, I think one case study was if you went into a department and they implemented an initiative last year, and then the fall rate decreased, but suddenly it's just dramatically increased again. What would you do? And so it's stuff that we are familiar with. We're not going to have to ask a lot of questions, about the industry. But yeah, so very few case-based questions. And then be prepared to answer questions about your personal life. I think on site, they really want to get to know a feel of, like, who you are. So they asked a lot about, like, my family and what it was like growing up. Yeah, so I think those were all the questions. And then I would say that in my first few interviews, a lot of times I'd walk away and I'd think, I never really got to say this, or this is something that probably would have benefit them if they knew about me. So, a lot of these interviews are timed because they want to be fair for every candidate. It's a really good idea for you to start integrating other things into your answer that is related, but that will also help them segue into other questions. I think the most difficult questions are the ones that, like, I don't know, obviously that you didn't prepare for. So one hospital I applied for was a for-profit hospital. And in retrospect, going into it, I was like, oh, I should know, why this is different from other hospitals that are nonprofit. And when they asked me, I, really didn't have a substantial answer that I feel like really satisfied them. You should know current events. So I know, like, I had friends who interviewed and they asked about the ACA and how that's going to affect hospitals in this upcoming year. And so when I went into my interview, I kind of expected it, and they never asked it. And so I brought it up in a lot of my answers, and I think that helped them realize, like, oh, she does know about, like, current events. It's a question that they probably hadn't thought to answer, but walking away, they knew that about me. So, that was good. Salary didn't come up. One advice that a fellow had given me an alumni at BU. She had gotten a fellowship, and the one advice she gave me was to negotiate the salary, which I didn't do and wish I had done. Walking into this, I had kind of thought, okay, I'm not going to get a fellowship, so I'm just not going to prepare for a salary negotiation. And that was kind of the wrong mentality, because when they offered it to me, I mean, one part of it was I was so relieved and was kind of worried that they would just take it away. So I was like, I'm not going to negotiate this. But later, like, should I switch jobs or, have to negotiate my next salary? The starting point is going to come off based off of this one, and fellowships typically pay lower than an entry-level job going into healthcare. So, I mean, I'm satisfied with the way things ended up, but I think that's something people going into fellowships should keep in mind. It doesn't hurt to ask. HR is separate from, whoever's going to be overseeing you. Obviously, you don't want to like push too much where they're like, okay, we're paying this person this much, so we're going to expect them to do like crazy things. You want to be reasonable, but you do want to at least ask if the salary is negotiable. And I would say most fellowships will say no anyways, but it's something savvy that people should do anyways. I would say it's easier to interview in a sense that, usually the job description includes your responsibilities. And so when you're preparing ahead of time, you kind of know what to focus on. Whereas a fellowship, usually they're rotation-based or at least project-based, and you don't know ahead of time what projects you're going to be put on. So, like, even though I already have a fellowship now, I still don't know, where I will be when it starts. So it's more, I would say it's kind of difficult in that sense to prepare. You kind of have to know every skill across the board. But at the same time, it's also unique in that you can bring in your own ideas. So for my fellowship interview, I definitely came in with a project that I said, this is something I would be interested in. Would it be possible to pursue here? And the answer was no. They liked the idea, but they were like, this is why we couldn't do something like that. But I think they liked that I came in with an idea, but that I was also flexible enough to, not go with it and pursue other things. Well, I mean, this is a fellowship I had really wanted, so I mean, in that sense, it was easy. There were definitely fellowships I interviewed for that during the interview, I was like, I don't know if this is the place I want to work for. But this fellowship was great in that I got to interview with the current and past fellows, so I also got to ask them questions, and they gave me a really good sense of who they are. I really like their retention rate. That's something that people should ask in their interviews. Obviously during an interview, they're probably not going to tell you if someone left, for a negative reason, or they might not even know that certain fellows didn't enjoy the program. So that's outside research you would have to do. But in my case, the program had a really high retention rate. And they just were also provided a lot of support for their employees. Well, other than the phone interviews, I would say look up your competitors. That was also something, they're probably not going to ask about competitors, but it's something that you should know going in so that, you can bring it up and show them how much you know about the hospital. It really is about who is the most knowledgeable about the hospital and how it's going to work for them. If you approach every fellowship interview like it's a general fellowship, you're probably not going to get hired. You want to talk about really specifics about the hospital. I think that's it. And I would also say, again, contact local hospitals that, don't seem to have a fellowship, because a lot of them are now realizing that fellowships are a great investment. So a lot of hospitals are developing new fellowships every year.